schools in light of COVID-19. My name is Alyssa Capella, and I'm Prisma's Vice President for Leadership Development. Prisma's focus from the day this crisis started has been to support you, your schools, and communities in the most critical questions and decisions you're facing. Our work is focused in key areas. First, we're focused on curation and dissemination of critical information to school leaders on topics like virtual learning, fundraising, finance, and legal in face of the unprecedented challenges we're facing today. We're committed to serving as the network for sharing information between school leaders, and our online ResChat groups are host to dozens of conversations among school leaders every day. We know that you cannot do this work alone, and we're working alongside you to identify and address the common questions that our leaders are asking and facing, both about immediate decisions as well as contingency and long-term planning. And we're looking to share that information back with you. We're also serving as the point of contact with North American leaders in infectious disease, including the CDC and the US Department of Health and Human Services, as well as curating resources from Canadian leading experts who are already working to guide our schools in Canada. Our resource page is constantly being updated, where we have and we will be posting the link in the chat, so in case you don't have that yet, you can access our Knowledge Center. And as the crisis is developing, we're hearing more and more concerns from schools and other nonprofits about financial and legal issues. We're grateful to all of you for joining together with us today and with our presenters so we can share with you what we've learned and address some of your most pressing questions. Thank you for being here and for all you're doing to support your schools and communities. And I see that my colleague Deborah has posted in the chat, if you're not yet joined into one of our ResChat groups, she's sharing the information there for how you can join. A few notes of logistics on today's webinar. The webinar will be recorded, and the slides, the recording will all be available on our Knowledge Center. And for all those of you joining us today, we will also be emailing you the slides along with the notes and the recording as soon as it's available. You're all muted and will be muted throughout the presentation. We've collected some of your questions in advance and we'll be addressing them throughout the webinar. We will also be taking questions live throughout the webinar. So please drop your questions into the chat and we'll be monitoring the chat closely throughout the webinar so that we can best address what's on your mind. Our format today will be a formal presentation by Chaim and Dan with time for questions in between. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our two presenters, my colleague Dan Perla, Senior Director for Catalyzing Resources, and Chaim Book, founding partner of the law firm Moskowitz and Book. Chaim's practice concentrates in the area of employment law. He is the past Senior Vice President of Congregation Kasher in Tenafly, New Jersey, and the former President of Torah Academy of Bergen County in Teaneck, New Jersey. Chaim's full bio can be found in our webinar notes. And we're most grateful to Chaim and to Dan for joining us today. And it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Chaim to start us off. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate the introduction. And I apologize if there's a light fixture in your face. I'm trying to figure out the best angle to get, here we go. I think that should work. Okay, so there are a very substantial number of issues that are facing both the community as well as the business community, and we've been trying very hard to tackle as many of these issues as we can, with an understanding that laws obviously differ from state to state, and we have, of course, a new federal law which is overarching and about to go into place, and a lot of people have questions about it. So in the short time that I have, I'm going to try to address the issues that I'm able to. So number one is, I think it's important for all schools and organizations to really think about both the shorter term and longer term in terms of how they're going to handle their employees. So specifically, what I mean by that is, one has to identify who their essential and non-essential staff are at this current time. I know a lot of schools are offering online programming, have remote learning for their students, and therefore Obviously, the teachers and a great deal of the administrators, are occupied and are being paid their salaries, and appropriately so. At the same time, one would naturally think about how one can engage in any type of cost-saving measures, because this is going to be a difficult several months ahead of us. To that end, if there are non-essential staff, and as we have here on the slide, some of the staff to consider would be whether it's assistant teachers, if a teacher is able to handle the remote learning on their own, doesn't need an assistant, cafeteria staff, maintenance staff, maybe some of your office staff, security staff. These are all folks that you would want to really think about. Under a scenario where you are going to be either reducing hours for some of the staff, which is one option. Many states have in place laws which would allow folks whose their schedules are reduced. Let's say, just as an example, as long as it's more than 20% or more, they will be eligible in those states where they have partial unemployment benefits. They will be eligible to file for unemployment and get a partial benefit. So, in an example, you reduce all of a certain category of staff by 50%. Then those employees in the states where there are partial unemployment benefits available, such as New York and New Jersey, they would be able to file for a partial unemployment benefit. Other things to consider are the possibility of putting certain personnel in certain categories on furlough, which is another word for a temporary layoff. They are entitled to unemployment benefits. According to what we're hearing, the latest word out of Washington, unemployment benefits are about to be beefed up considerably. Right now, they're at about 50% of salary, capped at a certain number. So the actual number is probably lower than that, but there is discussion of beefing that up. Other possibilities, depending on what state you're in, are if the employee is ill, there is a possibility of after any paid leave is paid, there's a possibility of putting people on disability. If someone is had a situation where they're caring for other family members who are ill, there might be some benefits available there as well. So there are all type of different options to consider with respect to staff who are non-essential. I'm just going to jump to the next subject here because I don't want to run out of time. On the other hand, folks who are contracted, such as teachers, administration, who have contracts, you have to look at what your contract says. Many teachers' contracts do say that they're at-will employees, and if they're at-will employees, then the same consideration that I mentioned about the other staff would apply. If they're not at-will employees, there might be some provision in the contract that they have that might require you to pay them for a continued period of time. Those are things that you need to consider on a case-by-case basis. I've also been asked in advance about questions about contracts for next year, and that is an interesting question that we can get into. I don't think of it. I cannot think of any substantive change that I can suggest on a global basis. But you will want to think about what your teacher contracts for next year will look like. I'll move on to the next slide if whoever's handling the slide can do that. I've also been asked a lot of questions about, unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of people have either lost their jobs either on a temporary or on a permanent basis. And so a number of parents are asking about their tuition obligations for the current year. Obviously, every school is going to have their own tuition contract with their parents, and that's the first place that you need to look. There are folks who are raising a question as to, well, if you're not offering me the same types of services and the same type of education that you were offering before the remote learning began, aren't I entitled to some type of refund or rebate, et cetera? My general advice on this has been, obviously, it's going to differ on a situation to situation question, but my general advice on this is, most tuition contracts that I've seen, that I've had the ability, either because as a parent that I've been given, or as a lawyer and counselor that I've seen, you're providing the best education that you can under the circumstances that we're under, and I don't see any legal basis for someone to ask for a tuition refund for the current year. you might want to think about whether there's any possibility of refunding or crediting any money for services that are no longer being used. For example, if there is some type of security fee and now your security costs are lower. If there's some type of activity fee and now your activities have been canceled for the rest of the year. If there's some type of meal plan and now there's obviously the meals are not being offered. So you definitely want to look at, there are two aspects to this, I would say. Aspect number one is you want to look at your contract with your vendor to see what your rights are with respect to your getting a refund for anything that was already paid in advance for this year, or whether you have the right to stop paying if you not paid for the full year. You want to see whether you can stop paying because there's obviously no need for those services. And if you are getting some type of relief because of that, then you might want to think about whether you can give a refund or a credit to parents for that. Then I think that covers the issues that I wanted to cover in my initial presentation, but I'm happy to address further questions and further issues as they come up in additional questions. I'll pass the microphone, so to speak, to Dan.
Well, before I jump into the financial implications side, we want to take some questions now. Chaim, I've asked, there are a number of Prisma staff members on the call, my colleagues Deborah Schaefer-Seaman, Melissa Capel, Tracy Stratford, Amy Adler, who are all fielding or trying to field various questions coming in from different areas. I'll start with one, but I'll ask one or two of my colleagues to jump in with questions related to legal issues. Again, we'll cover financial issues momentarily, and then we'll open up the chat for questions related to financial issues. One question that I'm seeing, Chaim, is what about preschools or infant programs vis-a-vis tuition? If they're not able, presumably, programs, does your view on tuition credits change for those types of programs?
It's an excellent question. We have dealt with that. We had one school that obviously completely closed down their preschool program, you do have to, as I said, in the first instance, look at what the tuition contract says to see whether there's any provision for it. Unfortunately, a lot of these contracts, are very short on detail. And so, you have to assess your situation and assess what makes the most sense. But I would say as a legal matter, I think it's a very substantial and compelling argument for a parent to say, you only provided with X number of months of an education, and I did not receive everything that I paid for. So I think in a preschool situation, the very strong consideration should be given to whether it's a refund, whether it's a credit. I think it's a very compelling argument.
Thank you, Chaim. Another question that's coming up is schools asking if they don't pay into an unemployment fund currently. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I suspect you do. What are the ramifications for schools that aren't paying into any type of unemployment fund?
It's a great question. I actually dealt with that question last evening. As you can imagine, the days have been very long here in the Book family home office. We had a 9 p.m. call with the school last evening, which asked that very question. And the answer, unfortunately, is very unclear because, yes, it is true that in certain situations that not-for-profits are not paying into any unemployment fund or are self-funded with respect to unemployment. And so that does raise a good question. We are looking at it. I wish I could give you a definitive answer on it. I would still urge, anyone who has employees that they have to put on furlough, that the employee should still file for unemployment, but we are looking into this to give a definitive answer on it.
Great. I've asked my colleagues who are also fielding questions if they have any that they want to summarize.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to jump in. There's a couple questions here that I wanted to make sure that we hit. If a school, let's see, they're popping in so quickly. If a school determines that their early childhood is not fulfilling its contract, Is it up to the school to determine a refund or a credit, or do the parents get to decide?
Well, that's a tough question for me to answer, but
I know, but I thought it's in here. I thought maybe others are thinking it as well. So
I appreciate that, Amy. You know, when all is said and done, you know, in certain situations we're sort of making decisions, you know, that sound and feel right, even if we don't have a definitive answer on it. This to me sounds like, you know, a question in that realm. And I would say it's really that every school has to make its own determination and decision.
Sure.
I know that, you know, that there are more robust and less robust remote learning programs as well. So, you know, that I'm sure there are parents who are feeling, well, you know, it's very nice that you're offering the remote learning options for my child, but it's still not a full day. It's still not a full program. You know, I go back to the very practical here. The fact of the matter is, as we all know, at the lion's share of every school's budget is going to be salary and benefits, and for the most part, you know, those expenses are continuing right now as schools are offering programming. And you know, the notion that just because the electric bills have decreased and the security has decreased, and you know, and you know, that there's some refund that's available, I think is not a compelling argument. I think if something is being offered, then that's the product that's being offered, and that we shouldn't be talking about refunds. On the other hand, if we're talking about a preschool, you know, that is completely closed down, which is, you know, happening with to speak of, then I think the school does have to think very, you know, carefully about the fact that, you know, that they're not providing anything that has been paid for.
right. Thank you. Another question that has also come up: in schools that have employees under contract till June 30th, how does that affect their ability to furlough?
Again, you have to see what the contract says. Many of the faculty contracts that we've drafted or that we've reviewed for schools, you know, have specific language in there that says that this is an employment at will relationship. And despite the fact that the term of the contract goes through June 30th, it may still be an at-will relationship. And if it's an at-will relationship, that means that you can change the terms of employment, so that you can say, you know, we don't have the work for you right now, and therefore, you know, we're either putting you on furlough, or we're putting you on unpaid leave, whatever the case might be, or whatever other type of leaves, and there are a number of different type of leaves that are available.
Okay. A couple questions about if schools do layoffs with their employees, what would be your advice and recommendation when they do reopen?
Well, when they reopen, I mean, the employees are being brought back. I mean, and are being put back on the payroll. I think it's that simple.
Great, thank you.
I want to thank everyone for these questions. Just to let you know, we will be creating a resource page that will provide access to, that will cover the questions in the chat, or many of the questions in the chat that weren't addressed. So keep them coming, because we will be able to put in writing some of the answers to your questions. And we'll have one more opportunity, I think, at the very end of the presentation for people to put in the chat some additional questions. So if I could ask, let's go back to our slide deck. And we're going to now turn from legal implications to financial implications around enrollment and tuition assistance. I want to start by sharing some national trends, because as we talk about our early estimates of what we expect to see in the 2021 school year, that is the next school year, I want to establish a baseline for where we are in the current school year. The numbers I'm going to share with you are estimates, and so take them as such. But we've estimated that in the current school year, there's approximately $2 billion of gross tuition. That represents that $2 billion of tuition, it comes from the approximately 300 Jewish day schools across the country, and 300 plus with our friends in Canada. I want to also mention for the Canadian schools that are on that there may be some legal differences here, and so Chaim has kindly addressed the issues in the United States, or at least as we perceive them to be unfolding. The legal issues may be somewhat or very different in Canada, but certainly the issues we know are very, very similar in both the United States and Canada. Coming back to these numbers, of $2 billion of gross tuition, we estimate that there's approximately $1.4 billion of net tuition, or as we like to say, a 70% net tuition rate. It will not surprise anyone on this call that the percentage of a budget coming from net tuition has been declining already prior to this crisis. And therefore, in thinking about estimates for next year, and these are just very preliminary estimates based on discussions with other communities and a handful of schools, we think that both gross tuition and net tuition will decline next year. As one suggestion, if you will, the way we're thinking about it is that we'll see at least a 5% decline from roughly $2 billion to roughly $1.9 billion of gross tuition. And the real jarring number, not surprisingly, will be in net tuition, where net tuition we're estimating will decline 10 percentage points. That is, net tuition, instead of representing 70% of gross tuition, will represent more like 60% of gross tuition. And that translates into approximately $1.17 billion of net tuition. Why is that the case? Again, we think that up to two-thirds of families next year will qualify for tuition assistance. That's up from approximately 54 or 55% this year. And we expect that those families currently on tuition assistance will understandably need more, possibly a lot more financial assistance. I want to note, you'll see this as a last bullet, I want to note that the schools we're talking to, including some very strong schools that have very stable enrollments, and in some cases modestly increasing enrollments, are already modeling next year for enrollment decreases of 5 to 10%. So please, as you are starting to do models, and we understand it's quite early, and that we have very imperfect information, and a lot of this is anecdotal, but still, for those of you endeavoring to start creating budgets for next year, think about what your trend line in enrollment has been and assume a 5 to 10% decrease from whatever that trend line had been. So if you were experiencing flat enrollment the last few years, you may want to budget next year down 5 to 10%. If you were growing at 5 to 10%, you may want to budget next year at flat. And again, for our purposes, we're modeling scholarship up significantly. Again, coming from both new, formerly full pay families now needing scholarship, as well as existing scholarship families now needing higher levels of scholarship. Many schools we've talked to are contemplating what to do with their tuition prices for next year, with some talking about tuition freezes. I'm not going to opine on this, but I will share that there are at least a handful or two of schools that we've spoken with that are contemplating some sort of tuition freeze. We've done webinars. I'll make a little plug here for work we've done in the past with a number of schools on the alternative tuition front, which is we've done webinars, which I think we can make accessible, certainly the material around alternative tuition programs, middle income affordability programs. Now would be a wonderful time to start thinking about those, if not for the 2021 year, certainly for the following year, because some of those programs do take time to develop and to implement. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. So I want to talk about, look at the positive side of this, which is we believe this is accelerating what has already been an interest in collaborations and opportunities for cost savings. I put in the chat, but I'll note again that staffing costs represent at least 70% or more of a typical school's overall budget. So it is a little incongruous to talk about cost savings or major cost savings without talking about some sort of new staffing models or staff reductions. I just want to note that up front. But having said that, in the short term, many of our schools in the past have explored PEOs, professional employment organizations. Some of our schools are members of professional employment organizations. We can talk more about that in the Q&A, or I can provide more resources on those entities. There's been understandably a renewed interest in health insurance buying consortiums. I'm calling them cooperatives. They're really consortiums. The Federation of Northern New Jersey, which represents the Bergen County Jewish Day Schools, several years ago put together a health insurance consortium. They have 5 of their schools already on that program, and the early results seem to indicate some savings in medical costs for each of the schools that participate in that. And there have been a number of schools and Prisma as an organization that have started to look at self-insurance programs. I don't want to get into a lot of details there, and I don't want to scare people. That doesn't mean that each school would be foregoing all their health insurance and self-insuring their employees themselves. It's just it's programs that allow you to incorporate an element of self-insurance in there. Another big opportunity we believe that's emerging will be in online or blended learning. There were many schools that have, prior to this crisis, where everyone has essentially gone to an online or virtual platform. Many schools historically embraced online learning, but focused on it purely for the educational benefits, without looking closely at the potential cost savings. And we're now seeing more schools. We're part of conversations and will continue to be part of conversations looking at blended learning as a possible cost saving tool as well. And I already mentioned that reviewing your leadership structure models. Are there opportunities to reduce your administrative staffs or combine positions? And that's happening real time as we speak. Again, we know these things are extremely fluid at the moment, and we're hitting you with a lot of thoughts based on what we are hearing happening in the field and areas that we've developed at least some level of expertise in the past. If I could ask, thank you very much. I want to also focus now on available resources. This is a list. This is a partial list of the many, many things that are happening, and they are happening so fast that I put this together last night. Had I put it together this morning, there would have been additional items on this. At the national level, as many of you may know, there is a request that JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, is one of the representatives of Jewish day schools and many other nonprofit Jewish organizations, is part of a consortium that is advocating, as part of any potential government bailout or program, a $60 billion request for nonprofit support. I should note that Prisma is partnering with JFNA and other major network organizations, such as the Foundation for Jewish Camp, Hillel, the JCC Association, to maximize the available funds available for nonprofits. And I'll also add that once that's in place, if and when that's in place, this group will be working together to help organizations such as day schools access those funds. So we'll also be in touch with you about those mechanisms, those access mechanisms, once we see how these programs and the dollar amount of support. On the local level, we've been in touch with many federations and foundations who are looking at increasing their support. I don't want to go into the particulars yet, and it's still a fluid situation, but I think it is fair to say that our day schools and our families can expect more federation and foundation support, whether that takes the form of loans or outright grants or monies for programs, still to be determined, and will obviously vary by community. But I'm cautiously optimistic that that is happening, and that will happen. And lastly, I'll mention that a number of Hebrew-free or Jewish-free loan associations across the United States, but especially in large cities such as New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Toronto, have introduced special free loan programs in response to COVID-19. And I'll also add that if your city or community doesn't yet have a program, it may be in the works. And we're happy to be in touch with you if you'd like more information on those. But a simple Google search will usually turn up that program. Next slide, please, if we have one, or are we done? Okay.
That was it.
Okay, great. I want to just sort of come back and make sure that I was clear in some of my language, and I want to offer a couple of caveats. Number one, nothing on this call should be construed as legal advice. Chaim is an attorney and well-versed in these issues, but we always ask schools to, before they take any action, certainly that has legal implications, to please consult your own legal advisors. I want to also be clear in some of the guidance we've provided around staffing that each school really needs to look at its own financial situation before making these decisions. Some schools may want to consider reducing their non-essential positions immediately and explore new staffing models or blended learning models for the next year and beyond. Some may choose not to, and we understand that. And I think I'm going to leave it at that in terms of my formal comments, and now open it up to questions. And again, I'll ask my colleagues, since I haven't been able to follow the chat and speak at the same time, if they could sort of jump in with a summary of some of the questions.
Dan, thanks so much for your comments. A number of folks are asking about Prisma's role in all of this. Will Prisma provide a bailout? This doesn't sound sustainable. How can Prisma help financially? Are there large donors out there? I know that you touched upon this, but would you give us an overview of what you see as Prisma's role around the financial implications and the partnerships that you just described?
Sure. So I think I see our role in two ways. Number one, first and foremost, we want to be sharing out information. We want to be culling that information. We want to be sharing it out to you in ways that are digestible. So if you go to the Prisma website, we have a link to all sorts of resources related to COVID-19. As Deborah mentioned, our restaurants, there's a link for it's in the chat. Tracy's provided a link to Prisma's Knowledge Center, which has a significant number of resources. And as I've said on prior calls, check that site daily, check our site daily, because it really, really is changing, and we're updating and adding new things every day, sometimes multiple times a day. To come back to the question, so one is we want to be a resource for sharing information. We want to be a resource for suggesting ways to access programs. We want to share programs that are available, financial and otherwise, and as well as ways we're happy to play a role in advising how to access those funds as well. More to the point of this question, we are in active conversations both with the large foundations, both regional and national, as well as federations and central agencies about programs that they might offer for that either general programs that might benefit day schools or day school parents. I've been in active touch with a couple of the major Hebrew Free Loan societies to see what might be done specifically for day school parents struggling with tuition payments. I don't want to suggest that these are likely to be sources of hundreds, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of dollars. But I would suggest that right now there's a real spirit of cooperation and generosity, and I would expect that we're only at the beginning of a series of programs that will address some of the financial needs. But again, I don't want to leave anyone under the impression that if we're looking at a $100-200 million type gap system-wide next year, based on increased scholarship needs and or declining enrollment, that somehow anyone's going to be able to wave a magic wand. But I do think, and close that gap, but I do think that these local and national programs will help meaningfully.
Thank you. The United States announced federal funds being made available for small businesses. Do you think that nonprofit schools might qualify as small businesses in order to be eligible for those funds?
So that's a great question, and if one of my colleagues on the phone knows more, they're happy to jump in. My understanding is that that there is a $60 billion ask or advocacy campaign underway. I referenced JFNA and a consortium of other nonprofits that are representing, JFNA I believe is representing Jewish organizations in this, but there's a $60 billion request. So the idea is that if there's going to be a fund for small businesses, that nonprofits, possibly or probably including many of our day schools, would qualify. That's the ask. I don't actually know the current status of that. I don't know that anyone knows the current status at the moment, but if anyone knows more, feel free to call. Thank you.
This is Paul Bernstein. Just to add to that, the draft legislation, which of course is now no longer draft, but I don't know what the actual final documents say yet. The draft legislation was saying that nonprofits would get up to $60 million, which of course puts us and others in the position of competing with hotels, airlines, and everyone else in the world. What JFNA and others were trying to lobby for is that it would be at least $60 million, and we'll see where it comes out. We don't know what the final wording is going to be. I would expect JFNA to be providing us with a briefing document today, or a worst case tomorrow, that we will share once we have it. And then we're working with them and with the other organizations that Dan mentioned in terms of how can all of us help individual schools and other agencies get access to the funds that they may be able to apply for.
Thank you, Paul. Dan, Chaim, given the federal first Coronavirus Act, can you furlough employees immediately, or do you have to offer the 2-week emergency and family leave of 80 hours first?
I'm going to ask Chaim to address that, if he knows.
Sure. So, first thing to keep in mind is that that federal law is not yet in effect. Goes into effect April 1st. So that is one very good reason to consider what you want to do, and do it very quickly, because it's our position that folks who are on furlough as of today through April 1st are not going to be eligible for those federal benefits. Alternatively, the federal government is promising that those payments that will be made under that program, that there will be somehow reimbursed by the government. Right now, our understanding is that the government will be reimbursing, so to speak, employers for those payments through tax credits, through payroll tax credits. There was some discussion about possibly actually fully reimbursing employers for whatever payments they make under that act. Just to give you a very, very quick summary of what we're talking about, let's understand. Those benefits are not available for employees who are working who are at home now because the governor has ordered everyone to stay at home, and their job is not an essential job, and there's no way for them to do it remotely. Those benefits are only going to be available for people who are either sick, caring for a family member who's sick, has children home from school because of a school closure. So it's not going to be available for people who don't fit into those categories. So that is a very key thing to keep in mind. So once April 1st comes around, there may be an obligation to provide some payment to employees who you will no longer be keeping on the payroll. You should definitely, depending on what state you're in, find out what state laws require you to do. But on a federal level, for those categories of employees, there will be an obligation to provide paid sick time for 2 weeks at a cap in terms of how much you'd have to pay them. And then for certain other people, most notably those who will have to stay at home because their children are home from school and they don't have any remote work options, and they don't have they're not working at an essential business. So those employees will be available for an additional 10 weeks, again, capped at a certain number. And then the question is how that will get reimbursed to you, whether it's through a tax credit or a direct payment.
And Chaim, a follow-up that's again U.S. specific. Is there a role for 12 weeks of emergency FMLA salary here, or relief?
Again, that's only going to be regarding employees who have children home from school and are not able to do their work remotely and are not working for an essential business. So, you know, the emergency relief under the new federal law is providing 2 weeks of paid sick time for people who are either actually sick or are looking after a family member who's sick, as well as people who are home because their children are home from school. But the additional 10 weeks beyond that, to take it up to 12 weeks, is only available for people who have children at home who and not in school.
Got it. Thank you. We have a question coming in about staff who are paid over 12 months for 10 months of work. So if employers were to lay off that employee now, would the employer be obligated to catch up on any outstanding payments, meaning continue to pay them over the 12 months for their 10 months of work? Or could they, it looks like they're saying, could they continue to pay residual over time?
So I can only answer that for New York and New Jersey right now. The answer to that is going to be yes. It would differ on a state-to-state basis, but in New York and New Jersey, I think the answer is certainly going to be yes. You would have to catch up on any payments.
Thank you. Dan and Chaim, this goes a little bit beyond your area of expertise, but I think that on everyone's mind, or on some people's minds, are the moral and practical considerations that we take into account that folks should be considering when they're considering these layoffs or furloughs.
So I'll take a first stab at that question, which is I think the question is exactly the right question to ask, and there are ethical and moral implications. I think we at Prisma understand that, and we're at the same time looking to protect the integrity and the sustainability of our institutions. And I think schools should be asking themselves, you know, to what extent am I jeopardizing, am I facing an existential challenge if I maintain staffing levels or salary levels at the exact level they are now? I think some schools will, there are schools that we're in touch with, some of the larger, stronger schools that have indicated, at least for now, they will continue paying all their staff. They'll continue paying security guards and cafeteria workers that aren't currently working. But they have they're not facing an existential threat. and they will get through this, or they believe they'll get through this. There are other schools that don't have the luxury of doing that and may be jeopardizing their own viability, their own financial sustainability. Every school is going to have to wrestle with that. And again, we're not advocating one solution over the other, though I think you are hearing Chaim say that there's reason to move quickly if this is an area that you're contemplating. I hope that addresses the issue. Chaim, anything you want to add to that as someone who's been on a board chair of a day school as well as an attorney?
Well, yes. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think that we're looking to do it's a difficult balance, right? I mean, on the one hand, you want to do what's best for your parent body, your community as a whole, and then you also want to do what's in the best interest of your staff, of your employees. Sometimes your employees, actually often your employees are community members as well. So you really want to do right by everyone. And so that's why, because of what we've been talking about until now, I think you really do have to take a very, very close look at who's essential, who's not essential. For those who are not essential, you want to put them in the best position where they could take advantage of the most benefits that will be available to them under law. And at the same time, you want to see what cost savings that you can achieve for your school or organization. And so to that end, if you can keep the payroll going until April 1st, with everyone on it, if you can afford that, if that's within the realm of what's doable for you, then I think that looking at this again from a moral and ethical standpoint, I think that you should really try to do that, because starting April 1st, when the federal benefits come into play, a good number, if not all, of those people who would be deemed non-essential, would very likely get two additional weeks of pay that will be more generous than what they could get under unemployment, and in all likelihood, you will get, if not fully reimbursed, by the government, certainly, the vast majority of it reimbursed by the government.
And Chaim, apropos of that, do we know yet about employees who get furloughed? What percentage of the regular salary they will be receiving?
Well, it's going to differ from state to state, because employees are furloughed. I mean, let's face it, furlough is a nice word for terminate. I mean, it's a temporary termination, but it's still a termination. So they're going to file for unemployment benefits. And if they're going to get unemployment benefits, they will get whatever is available under that state's law. In New York and New Jersey, it tends to be 40 to 50% capped at a certain number. According to what we're seeing out of Washington today, it's expected that the unemployment benefits, will get an additional, boost. I believe Senator Schumer said this morning that they're going to increase that minimum, that maximum by by another $600 a week, so which is very substantial. But we don't know the details on that yet. But certainly, it's going to differ from state to state.
Chaim, before we turn the floor over to Paul Bernstein, Prisma's CEO, can you please summarize for us 3 key takeaways that you want every leader on this call to be walking away with?
Sure. I mean, I think that number one is, really think through who the key people are that you need. Who are your essential and your non-essential employees? 2 is look at every possibility with respect to your relationships with your vendors and providers, where you could save money. As I said, in many cases, you will have already paid for certain services and for certain products for the full year, when you're not going to get the full advantage and full use of that. So you definitely want to look at whether you can stop paying those vendors and providers, or recoup money from those vendors or providers. I think that's a very important thing to consider also. And then going forward, I think that you should have whoever is providing legal advice for you to look at your all of your contracts, both your tuition contract, your teacher contracts, your contracts with your vendors, to look at, number one, what your rights are with respect to the current situation, and also think already now about what you want those contracts to look like in the future, so that you, whatever challenges you're facing now, that you won't, God forbid, have to face again.
Thank you, Chaim. Dan, I would love to pass the mic over to you to summarize 3 key takeaways from your presentation, and then I know you'll be passing over to Paul, and then summarizing, answering a couple more questions, and closing up for the day. So again, Dan, 3 key takeaways for all the school leaders on the call right now from your presentation.
Great. So to pivot off what Chaim said, but I'll put a slightly different nuance on it. One key takeaway would be that schools should differentiate between legal obligations and what I'll call ethical obligations. Again, many of you have asked about this, meaning that while I think you're hearing a general sense that unpaid tuition is a legal obligation. So whereas on the one hand, a parent who has the ability to pay that says, I don't have to pay, from a legal perspective, it's probably incorrect. There were ethical considerations, and there's a difference between people who can't pay and don't want to pay. And we're urging schools to be as flexible financially as they possibly can be, since many parents are under significant financial duress. So that would be one. Differentiate between your legal requirement and what the right thing to do is. By the way, that we didn't get into it, but that might apply to your contractors as well, the bus companies, the food service companies, the security firms that you're working with as well. There are legal implications, and then there are ethical things, and schools should differentiate between the two. I'd say the second is, second key takeaway would be to look at opportunities for cost savings beyond staffing. Again, acknowledging that staffing costs are the majority of the school's budget. Nonetheless, it's a wonderful time to be exploring alternative healthcare programs, collaborations, buying consortiums, professional employment organizations, and of course, blended and virtual learning, which is an area that, as I noted, some schools have started to explore. There have been consortiums, but now might be a wonderful opportunity to really explore virtual or blended learning as a potential for cost savings for not necessarily next year, but in the medium to longer term for day schools. That's number 2. And then number 3, just to sort of to end on a somewhat positive note, one key takeaway is there are significant resources already available, both financial and non-financial. Our Prizmah's website and the reshets are a great opportunity for the dissemination of that information, and there's much more to come. And so I do believe we're going to see more and more foundations, federations, Hebrew Free Loans, and entities that have historically provided more liquidity in times of crisis stepping up. It's still, as well as the potential for federal government funding. So I do not want schools to feel overwhelmed. We're suggesting that budgets are done on a conservative basis, but we also believe that there will be non-tuition revenue coming in, and significant amounts of it. The last thing I just want to add before turning this over to Paul is, not all of you may experience this when you're working within your schools, but as a national organization, we have been getting so many accolades on behalf of our schools. A major foundation person yesterday said to me, quote, "Our day schools are killing it." I'm sorry if that's maybe a bad quote, but what she meant by that is the day schools have been shining stars as organizations have closed their doors and have sent kids away in some cases with in some cases with good intentions, colleges and universities. The day schools have been providing services, not just educational services, but emotional and other support services as well. And it is being noticed both within the day school community and the broader Jewish community and outside of that community. And so if there was ever a moment where we were putting our best foot forward, this is the moment we have put our best foot forward and will continue to. And we should all take great pride in that as well. So with just a few minutes left, with 5 minutes left, I want to turn it over to Paul Bernstein, the CEO of Prizmah. I want to thank Paul not just for being on this, participating in this call, but for all the leadership he's shown and for really galvanizing all of Prizmah's resources for the benefit of serving the field during this crisis. Paul.
Thank you, Dan. We may come. Hopefully, I'm going to keep this brief. So if we can cover one or two more questions before the end, that will be wonderful. I want to say two things. One is appreciation, particular appreciation to Chaim Book and to Dan Perler for leading the conversation and for trying to answer as many questions, standing on not even one leg, I think, right now, to really respond to the questions. The questions themselves are phenomenally important. So I want to really appreciate the work that each and every person on this call is doing all day and every day for the sake of your students and your schools, and that making time to address the incredibly important questions that are coming up here, and I expect will come up even more. We're at the beginning, I think, of looking at and answering and responding to the financial as well as enrollment issues. And as Deborah just posted, there is an enrollment focused webinar tomorrow for anyone who's interested in that, that's in the chat or on our website. And what we're going to be doing from here is, as Dan said, sharing the resources and really working on where we can add the most value. For example, in that area of making sure that there is as much information and, more importantly, as much access to federal funds when they become available. Similarly, if there are funds in Canada, that we have access to those, and that we can work on what philanthropic funds can also be made available to the fields. And there is work going on in that area. Keep the questions coming to us, because that's how we learn what's important. And we are trying to pivot as rapidly and as nimbly as we possibly can to address the issues that are most crucial in the days ahead and perhaps more importantly in the months ahead. So we're grateful for the opportunity to do it. We're also very grateful on this call. There are a number of our Federation or BJE colleagues who are joining. So those that were asking Federation questions know that you're being heard. And we're working with federations across North America to partner with them on the best ways of response and the best ways for them to support as well. Last thing I want to say is, I think there was a comment that Steve Lorch put in just a little while ago, reminding us of some of the moral issues. And I would say the values base that we all bring to our work, and the values base that we're even bringing to a technical conversation on legal and financial issues, is really crucial. So thank you for what you're doing every day. And as Dan said, what we are hearing of the appreciation for what schools are doing and the way that Jewish day schools are leading the education world right now is incredibly powerful. So kol hakavod to everyone.
Great, thank you, Paul. I want to close by thanking my Prizmah colleagues. Thank you, Paul. Special thanks to Deborah Schaefer-Seaman, Amy Adler, and Tracy Stratford, who really helped make this all happen. A big thank you to Chaim Book of Moskowitz and Book, who's occasionally available for paid services as well as unpaid services. Again, I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules. Please, again, visit our website, email us with any questions, and we look forward to responding to the unanswered questions from the chat and providing that information to you as well. Thank you, everybody.